joining me for my live chat. I am so excited today because I have friends, colleagues, and plant-based experts with me today, Alex Caspero and Whitney English. Hi, you guys. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us,
Sharon. Thanks for having us on.
Yes, and we are going to be talking all about plant-based eating for children and families. I get so many questions on this topic, and Alex and Whitney are experts in this area, and they've really done a lot of great work. So we're going to really get into some great conversation points on how you can feed your families a healthy plant-based diet confidently and easily and deliciously. So I can't wait to talk to them. But I wanted to give you a little bit more information about Alex and Whitney. First of all, they actually co-founded Plant-Based Juniors, PBJs, which is a community for parents and educators interested in properly implementing plant-based diets for children. And they're dedicated to filling the gap in credible pediatric nutrition information for plant-based infants and children. They promote an all-inclusive, predominantly plant-based approach, supporting families from vegan to vegetarian to flexitarian. So basically, if parents want their kids to get more plants on the plates, PBJ is there to help them. And they have all sorts of great resources to support you along the way for your plant-based journey. And I'm holding up their brand new book, the Plant-Based Baby and Toddler book, which is a great guide for nutrition for plant-based families. They also have another book called the Predominantly Plant-Based Pregnancy Guide and First Bites, the Definitive Guide to Baby-Led Weaning for Plant-Based Babies. And they also have a PBJ's Batch Cook ebook. So welcome, guys. I'm thrilled you're here joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're so excited to chat.
So I wanted to kick this off by asking you a little bit about how you got started on this journey of plant-based nutrition, especially for yourselves and, for families and for children.
Yeah, I always joke and say that I wish I had a really inspired story, and I don't. I will say I was never a big meat eater. Like, my dad was a big hunter, and that was actually like a huge turnoff for me. I remember being like really sad about him hunting and didn't want to eat meat. And I kind of did that a lot in like elementary school, middle school, high school. And then in college, I was dating this like bodybuilder, this like protein obsessed meathead. He would wake up in the middle of the night and eat like tuna and drink milk, and it was whatever. So it was gross to me then. And we broke up, and I remember being like, you know what? That's it. Like, I need like a new identity after this guy. I'm really tired of eating meat. That was like such a gross experience for me. And my girlfriend, the morning that we broke up, brought me over a coffee and a copy of the book Skinny Bitch. And she was like, I think you're going to like this book. I think you should read this. You've kind of been talking about some of these things. And that was really, when I stopped eating meat. So that was in 2006. So wherever he is, thank you for sort of having that fresh start after that breakup. And then, just continuing to learn more and deepening into my nutrition education and dietetics. That was really sort of the catalyst for the path for me. And then, learning what you do, it's hard to turn back, right? You just have to sort of continue on because all of the benefits, not only for yourself, but also for, the environment and of course, what's happening to the animals.
That's great. What an interesting story.
It is a good story, Alex.
It's mine. I wish it was a little bit more inspiring, but yeah, that's the truth.
So how are you going to top that, Whitney?
Oh, she
Okay.
can.
I don't know if I can top it, but so I was always personally interested in nutrition and fitness, grew up in a very fitness focused family. But I always had kind of the wrong idea about nutrition. I totally bought into the whole idea that you needed to eat a lot of protein, and specifically animal protein, to be fit. I used to eat like 6 egg whites a day for years on end. And it wasn't until, so I got my start in Los Angeles as an entertainment reporter, and being interested in nutrition, was always trying to get to the bottom of the truth about the best way to eat. And I was hearing all this conflicting information. A lot of it was inaccurate at best and dangerous at worst. And I decided that if I wanted to become an expert in the field, that I needed to go back to school. And so I went back to school to become a dietitian after working as an entertainment reporter for about 6 years. And it was in my dietetics program I took a course with one of the leading researchers in the field of longevity, Dr. Walter Longo. And it was in that course that I learned about the immense benefits of a plant-based diet. And I was pretty shocked, because I had always kind of thought that plant-based eating was a little obscure. It was not the norm. It wasn't backed by science. And here it was confronted by just massive amounts of evidence-based information showing that this was the truth, the light. And I switched my diet right then, actually on the first day of class, after a very compelling PowerPoint presentation. And that was about 5 years ago. And I've been predominantly plant-based ever since. And Alex and I actually met about 10 years ago at a blogging conference. So when I was an entertainment reporter, I just had a blog on the side for fun, writing about at least what I thought was accurate about nutrition and fitness. And Alex was a dietitian writing her blog, Delish Knowledge. And we met at this bloggers conference and stayed in touch over the years. Fast forward 10 years later, I'm pregnant. I can't remember if Alex was pregnant or I just had her son, Vander, but we started talking on social media, DMing each other and swapping information, saying, we're both following plant-based diets ourselves, but is this really the safest option, the most optimal option for our kids? And where are you getting guidelines on how to do it? And we were just finding it was really difficult to get a lot of solid evidence-based facts on how to raise plant-based kids. And so we kind of said, well, we're doing all this research ourselves. Maybe we should put it together and put it out there to the public to help the average parent, because if we're having trouble finding this information, people who are not dietitians are probably really just in the dark.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we have had many of these conversations amongst ourselves. I can remember meeting you, Whitney, for the first time when you were studying nutrition. And I think we had lunch at a little restaurant in Silver Lake, a vegan restaurant in Silver Lake. And we were talking about this. And then of course, Alex, I've known for years because of her beautiful blog, Delish Knowledge. And, we've been at all the same conferences together over the years. And I remember us, talking about the fact there was so little good evidence-based writing on, for families, consumer-based writing on plant-based eating for children. So I'm glad that you really filled that gap.
Well, and
did it well.
Look, Whitney and I say, it's scary, when you're responsible for someone else's well-being. I mean, I really empathize with parents who are like, but are you sure, and really want to feel confident in their decisions. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of places they can turn, pediatricians perhaps aren't, as well versed as they need to be in plant-based diets to really help them and empower them about doing this safely. And so we really felt like, not only did we want to find this information out for ourselves, but we had to share it. We had to make sure that parents who were in a similar boat found, knew that it's not only safe for children, but also immensely beneficial, just like it is for adults.
And I mean, there are some dietitians who do specialize in this, but especially at the time that Alex and I got pregnant, the most recent book written by a dietitian on a plant-based pregnancy was 10 years old. Yeah. And so it just wasn't as accessible as it really should be.
Exactly. Some of the leaders in the field are retiring now, and there needs to be, because research changes, information changes, and we have more knowledge. So we have to really stay on top of it. Yeah. So I'm so glad you're doing that for people, and, really doing all that work, doing all the research and providing that information, and you're doing it for your own families too. So I think that's all great. I'm really proud of you guys for doing all of that work.
Oh, thank you, Erin.
Yes.
I remember from you. I was going to say, I remember being at, I think it was Today's Dietitian, and you were presenting on plant-based families. And I don't think I was pregnant yet, but I was thinking about it. I think I remember coming up to you and being like, okay, I need to see I want this presentation if I can have it. Like if I can see your references, that'd be great. Cause I just really need to make sure that what I'm doing is going to be the best.
Yeah. I remember that session that I did. I wrote an article for Today's Dietitian about it, and then I did a session. So it's really important topic. And I get, I've heard over the years, I've had, concerned mothers come to me. Is it really okay for me to do this? I want to do this, but can you really tell me it's okay? So I get what you're saying, because, we really want to make sure we're doing the best for our children. So
yeah, of course.
Yes. And that really leads me to my next question is, what are really those evidence-based benefits for children to eat a plant-based diet? I mean, what is the science showing us right now that, the benefits for children?
Yeah, so there's not as much research in children as there is in adults. Most of us are familiar with the benefits of a plant-based diet for adults. That's a reduced risk of pretty much every chronic disease out there, potentially longevity benefits. And although we have less research on kids, the research that we do have points in the direction that starting this diet early on will also lead to a reduced risk of those chronic diseases later in life. One thing that we see that shows that it is safe is that plant-based kids grow normally. So they fall into the normal range of weight and height compared to omnivorous kids, though they are typically weigh slightly less than on average. And that's probably a good thing. That's also what we see in adults, is that we have lower rates of overweight and obesity, which then puts you at a lower rate of other chronic diseases. We also see that plant-based kids have a much higher intake of really important nutrients like fiber, vitamin C. They eat more fruits and vegetables. And not only is this just good in itself, but it's also good because it sets them up for a lifelong positive eating relationship with these foods. The earlier we can get these foods normalized in the diet, the more likely they are to eat them as adults, which again, in turn will then put them at a lower risk of these chronic diseases later in life. So
Alex,
Sounds really great. Yeah.
I think the other thing that Whitney and I feel a lot is that we're constantly almost on the defensive when it comes to like proving that this is healthy. But in reality, the standard American way or the standard westernized diet that kids are on isn't exactly the pillar of health. 1 in 10 kids gets enough produce, 1 in 10 gets enough fiber. So really, when we say to parents, how can we get more plants on the plate? Even if you're not looking at this from sort of a strict veganism perspective or even a vegetarian perspective, I think we can all say, the way that we're currently feeding our kids just isn't rich in these whole food plant foods. We need to get all of these foods in our kids' diet for all of the reasons Whitney just mentioned. And so wherever we're at, wherever you're sort of starting from, if you can sort of challenge yourself to get more plants on the plate, you're going to see these health benefits, even if it's not that 100% level.
That's such a good point. And there is a lot of kind of this burden of proof, that there has to be all this proof that it's healthy. But we know that the standard diet is so poor right now. So people are already, kids are already missing all these nutrients we know are essential for health. So that's a really good point. I'm glad you made that.
Yeah, in the introduction to our book, we spend a large section flipping the switch, saying it's not our job to prove this. Why don't we show you what's actually happening with kids that are eating standard American diets? We've got type 2 diabetes on the rise and occurring in children as young as age 10. Yeah. And then there's numerous studies showing potential detrimental effects to health from meat-heavy diets. So as much as we want to share the benefits of a plant-rich diet, it's also important to point out the opposite.
Well, and the reality is too, when we're looking at children that are already nourished, so, sort of quote unquote, well-nourished children who already have the calories, the proteins, or the micronutrients that they need for growth, there's no study that shows adding meat is more beneficial. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to say too, is that, yes, we can look at malnourished countries and populations and sort of see perhaps a benefit in adding those foods in, but that's the nutrients. When we look at already nourished children, there's zero benefit for adding in more meat, and there's a plenty of benefits to adding in more plants.
Right. I mean, we're looking at a diet in Western nations when we were talking about all of this, where, we are consuming too much saturated fat, too much salt, too much sugar, too many calories. So it's different. And, some of the research that I've read is not only pointing to the benefits later on in life, which you alluded to this a little bit, but even showing immediate benefits for children, because as you mentioned, we are starting to see these risk factors in very young children, heart risk factors, diabetes risk factors. So it's not just making them healthy later on in life. It's like immediate health benefits we're starting to see for children who are eating plant-based diets. So I think that's great.
True. There have been recent studies showing better cardiometabolic profiles in children who are eating plant-rich diets and lower levels of certain inflammatory molecules. So there are things we can see right away.
Well, and the other quick thing I'll just sort of add too that we haven't touched on yet is we're also introducing these foods to kids as part of their culture, as part of their sort of normal diet, right? Which whether or not they continue to sort of eat this way or not as they get older, these foods contain, they're all sort of foods that they consider to be their types of food. So they're not weird. They're not, crazy foods when they're 20 saying like, hey, have you had some lentils? Have you had some beans today? It's like, oh yeah, those are part of my, foods I already like because I've developed that taste preference so early in life.
That is such a great point. And I have to just say, I have two sons who one is 22 and one's 23. And I don't think there's a pulse that they don't eat, and a whole grain that they don't eat, or very few vegetables. And even though they could be picky eaters when they were toddlers, it was just a transient phase for them. And I often reflect on that, that as young adults, they have a very robust vocabulary for plant foods. And I think that's something that we don't focus on enough, is that kind of that introduction and that adventurous palate to all of these healthy foods, it can just be lost along the way if kids aren't introduced to them. So that's a great point too.
Yes. And I love you saying that your children are loving those foods now. My son is going through like a very selective eating phase. And I'm like, I just know you're going to get through this. I just know you're going to get through this. But I like to know that one day we will be eating all of these various pulses and vegetables and whole grains together, and he will love them.
I know it is challenging at times, but it's comforting to know that it does work. All that exposure does work.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you guys about, because you deal with so many families, you hear from so many parents. What are some of the concerns that you hear from parents when they want to have a plant-based lifestyle for their families and their children? What are some of the things they're worried about?
I think the first one we'd say is probably protein, which is such I shouldn't say a silly concern, because I understand that, parents are looking at these periods of growth. They want to make sure their children are getting what they need. But really, protein deficiency is not a thing in developed countries. So even with vegan children, we look at studies that we have, they get about 2 times the amount of protein that they need. Omnivore kids, depending on what we're looking at, 3-4 times the amount. So we're really not worried about protein intake. And, the reminder to all parents that protein comes in so many different foods, right? Especially if we're talking about even a toddler, if we're giving them, 2 cups of soy milk a day, that's likely going to be most of their needs when it comes to the RDA of how much that toddler needs. Things like whole grains are great sources of protein too. So, really sort of educating parents on where protein comes from and trying, I think, to shift the idea that it's not, yes, it's found in animal products, but there's lots of plant foods that contain protein, and also sort of, where those amino acids are found. So I think that's probably the biggest one that we get. The next one is likely iron. And, that's likely a good reason. Iron deficiency anemia is the most common nutrient deficiency for all children, for, really adults too, when it comes to what we're looking at. And, we're really big on educating the idea that the iron that's found in plant foods is non-heme. It's going to be less bioavailable, but there are easy ways to get around that and to make it as absorbable as heme iron. So pairing it with vitamin C increases the absorption of non-heme iron by about 3 to 6%. Offering like sprouted grains and sprouted grain products is also going to help increase the bioavailability of iron. So there's sort of some easier tricks that parents can do to make sure that the iron they are giving is as bioavailable as possible.
And similar to protein, iron is really widespread in a plant-based diet. There are even some studies that show, well, I think a lot of the studies show that plant-based dieters actually end up getting more iron than omnivores. And if you compare a serving of beef, say for babies, to a serving of beans, it actually has the same amount of iron. So if you're employing these techniques like pairing with vitamin C, trying to get sprouted grains, relying on iron fortified baby cereals, preferably an oat-based one when necessary, then you can absolutely meet their iron needs. And there's no reason to need to incorporate red meat, despite what you might hear.
I was going to say, I think even in the dietetics community, there's been this big push from the beef industry about beef is the perfect first food. And we've been seeing this, constantly on social media and even at conferences and presentations. But really, like Whitney said, when you step back, what is it? 2 ounces of beef contains 1.5 milligrams of iron. So if we're looking at the requirements for an 8-month-old, you'd have to give them 14 ounces of steak a day. Like, no one's doing that, and that's such a silly recommendation even to begin with. And so it's, yes, beef contains iron. It also contains saturated fat. It also contains cholesterol. There's other things that we know from studies that too much of that can also be harmful, especially in kids as well. So, really sort of taking a step back and saying iron is important, iron is needed, and here are all the places that it's found in plant foods.
And this is a place too where the messages from our government also get twisted. The dietary guidelines for Americans just came out recently with the first time that they released recommendations for the 0 to 2 age range. And it was right after this that the beef industry did their big push saying, even the DGA says that beef is a great first food for babies. And if you really dig into what the advisory panel had submitted, they said babies need iron as a priority nutrient, for babies starting at 6 months. And red meat is a good source, but they also explicitly said that there was no added benefit for growth or development or iron levels when providing meat if the babies are already getting iron from other sources. So their recommendation was feed iron-rich foods, feed iron-fortified foods, get the iron, but they never said anywhere that beef was superior or necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that's not what people were hearing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in fact, now we have research showing that the heme iron may potentially be one of the risk factors behind high red meat consumption. So it's turning out that the non-heme might be a better source. So there are a lot of things going on, but I'm glad you cleared that up, because I do, even in our community of nutrition, I do hear concerns about the iron.
Yeah.
And, even myself, I've eaten an exclusively plant-based diet for 10 years. My iron levels are always fine. Of course, I'm speaking as an adult, but, the research shows that it is possible, with a well-planned, balanced diet to meet your needs. So I'm glad you're addressing that. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the pitfalls that you do see people making, as they're feeding their children plant-based diets. What are some of the things that you're concerned about for them?
Yeah, I would say that the big thing that we really educate parents around is the need for fat, especially sort of we're talking about the older infant, the younger toddler. One of the benefits about a plant-based diet is that a lot of the options in it tend to be naturally lower in fat. And, that's great when we're talking about adult populations. But when we're talking about, infants, toddlers, really this period, especially of like cognitive development, we want to ensure that we're getting enough fat and not shying away from using plant oils and cooking. Using nut butters where appropriate. Nut butter can also be a choking hazard. Whole nuts and seeds are also not appropriate to give to a 15-month-old. So, really educating parents on where else fats are found in the diet and how to use them, even if as an adult, perhaps you're not conditioned to cook that way or to prepare meals that way for yourself. The importance of it when it comes to that age group, 35, 40%, we want the calories to be coming from fat.
Mm-hmm. I think another pitfall is an obsession with purity. Mm-hmm. People who follow plant-based diets, many are really concerned with health, and that's a great thing. And that's why a lot of us jump on a plant-based diet. But when it comes to our kids, this can sometimes result in disaster if your drive to find the most pure whole foods option outweighs some of your children's needs. So a good example is when we hear some of these horrific headlines about baby dies of a vegan diet, when we look at it, it's often that the baby was actually malnourished, and it really has nothing to do with a plant-based diet, except for the fact that perhaps parents, instead of feeding their baby formula, were maybe trying to make their own homemade nut milk or something like that is not nutritionally adequate for a baby. And that might be one place where parents just really need that education that, yes, I'm sorry if you don't like the formula options that are on the market, but the safest route for your baby is going to be providing a formula. You cannot make your own homemade milk. So that can happen. Other things like what Alex was just talking about with the fat, we often hear people who follow very low fat whole foods diets. They don't want to serve oils because they think they're too processed, but oils are a really excellent source of fat for our babies. So parents just kind of have to restructure the way they think about nutrition and really focus on meeting kids' needs, whether or not that is the purest ideal option in your mind.
I'm glad you brought that up because I do see that too. And some of the scary headlines have surrounded these diets that are very extreme and they're not meeting the kids' needs. And this idea that, young children should have nothing but whole foods when in some children, can't meet their needs without a little bit of refined foods in there, because it's just so high in fiber, all these foods, and they just build up so quickly. And, and we all who've had children know they can't sit at the table for too long eating. There's a lot of chewing. So sometimes, it's okay to have some refined foods in these situations, right?
Yeah, we actually call it the whole grain paradox. So before the age of 2, we actually recommend that parents do provide about 50% of grains as refined grains. And, this can be tailored to your child. If you've got a child that's a great eater and putting down a ton of food and having no digestive issues after one, then they can do more whole grains. But when babies are taking in very little and filling up very quickly on these fiber-rich plant foods, sometimes it can be too much. And so that's why we recommend kind of splitting it up with refined grains. And that's where the paradox is. For adults and older kids, we do want to focus mainly on whole grains, but for babies who we really just need to be giving lots of calories to and really focusing on growth, refined grains can be a great way to meet those needs.
Yeah. And it also, of course, I think we have to remember that eating should be pleasurable for children too. And, there's all the social elements of eating too. So I'm glad you addressed those things about not getting too much of this perfectionist idea with the plant-based diet.
Yeah, well, especially when we look at, as kids get older and the research on restriction. I mean, we have a big section in our book about that. But, look, we might be dietitians, but like my kid gets, vegan ice cream, he gets, pizza, he gets cookies. I also want him to know that like these foods exist and they're not scary. And like they can exist in a healthful diet. Here's how we act around them, and not putting these foods up on this like really high pedestal and being so nervous and scared around them, because that can also have some detrimental effects as they get older.
That's really important too. I also wanted to touch on pregnancy and breastfeeding. Are there any things that you kind of recommend when it comes to plant-based? Are these diets safe, plant-based diets safe during pregnancy and breastfeeding?
Yeah, so plant-based diets are safe really through all aspects of the life cycle, whether we're talking about pregnancy, lactation, infancy, like we've touched on before. And this is not just our position, it's also the position of the Academy of Dietetics and Nutrition. So it's really the idea that a well-planned diet, and that's really what we're here talking about, right? And all diets should be well-planned. But when it comes to pregnancy, yes, a well-planned plant-based diet, whatever that looks like, is not only safe, but likely healthful as well for a lot of the same reasons that we talked about when it comes to adults, but even for children as well. We see that in research they have lower rates of pregnancy-related complications, so things like gestational diabetes, preeclampsia. It's not necessarily going to prevent, but we do see in research that it can reduce the risk for a lot of women.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So I also wanted to let you bust some myths that are out there for plant-based diets, or any urban legends that you're hearing about that you just want to put a stop to.
Probably the number one is that soy is unsafe for kids, and specifically boys. We hear a lot about that it's going to interfere with their development. And there's just no evidence to support that. In fact, we have the reverse. We have decades and decades of research of children that have been having massive amounts of soy at an early age because those babies that were fed soy formula. So there's one specific study that I like to reference, and it followed up with, it compared children who were fed soy formula to those fed cow's milk formula, and it followed them up when they were between the age of 25 and 30. And out of 30 different reproductive and endocrinological and I always mess this word up.
I know that's a hard one.
You know what I mean. And development parameters, there were no differences between the groups. And if there were going to be harms from soy, we would see those in children receiving massive amounts of isoflavones early in life. That's their only source of nutrition. So there's absolutely no research to support these claims. And in fact, at least for girls, we have research showing the opposite. There's research showing that young girls who have a high consumption of soy early in life have a reduced risk of breast cancer later in life. And we see that in women, adult women as well. Those with a high intake have a lower risk of breast cancer, but that risk is further reduced if the soy consumption begins earlier in life. So not only is soy not harmful, it's likely beneficial for kids. Yeah. It's also a really excellent source of lots of different nutrients that we want to prioritize in children's diets, things like protein, healthy fats, specifically omega-3 fatty acid, ALA, and then another nutrient, choline, which is a B-like vitamin that people have been talking a lot about in the past 10 years. It's really important for kids' brain development. And while it is widespread in a plant-based diet in small amounts, the highest, the best source of choline in a plant-based diet is soy. And so we think in order to meet choline needs, it is really important to include soy on a daily basis.
I love that because I do see so many parents avoiding soy and, adults, plant-based adults as well, and needlessly. And it's such an important food, especially for children, because, the tofu is such a great toddler food, for picking up. You can use it in so many different recipes. And then soy milk is such a nutritious plant milk for children.
Yeah. So, and that's really the plant-based milk that we recommend. We get a lot of questions on, can I use almond milk? And the reality is that a lot of the non-dairy milks out there are not very nutrient rich, right? So they tend to be lower in calories, lower in protein, lower in fat. Soy really is the optimal choice. And that's also what the American Academy of Pediatrics says as well when it comes to non-dairy alternatives. And, the other thing is too, we also want to promote eating more pulses, more beans, soybeans, also because of the lysine needs. And so including soy milk a few times a day is a really easy way for parents to meet those needs.
I agree with you 100%. I always recommend fortified soy milk.
It's great. Yeah. And it's delicious.
The number one. It's mild, it's versatile. Yes. I get the unflavored, non-sweetened one. Yeah. And that's my go-to. So
I think my kids eating a plant-based diet without
soy. Yeah.
Yes. I could never.
It wouldn't work for me.
And in fact, as we all know, the research from other countries that consume a lot of soy, they have lower rates of all of these.
That's right.
Conditions, whether it's breast cancer or some of these fears that we have about development and everything. They have low risks of these things, and they consume a lot of soy. I have traveled extensively in some of these countries, and it's like they eat a lot of soy. Yeah. And we're worried about our little bit of soy intake here,
And I think that people sometimes confuse, they'll say things like, 90% of the soy out there is, genetically modified. And like, oh yeah, that's true because it's being fed to animals. But when we talk about actually the soy that's grown for human consumption, it's a much smaller percentage of that crop. There's also no such thing as good soy and bad soy. We can talk about soy protein isolate and the other factors perhaps that are in those foods. But actually a lot of the clinical studies are using soy protein isolate because it's really easy to, not be distinguished, right? When you're eating a piece of tofu, but you don't know perhaps you're eating a tofu burger or soy burger that's made to mimic beef. So you don't know which group you're in. And so, trying to also talk to parents too, that soy is well studied and it's healthful.
Yes, so it's a traditional food. It's been around for centuries, part of healthful diets. So yeah, it's a really important one. I hope we make progress on that because I just hate to see people exclude it from their plant-based diets. And then, then when you start seeing other exclusion, that's one thing that I worry. I'm sure you worry about that too. When you see people, then maybe they take out tree nuts. Okay, they're not doing soy now, they're taking out tree nuts. And what else are they taking out? And then your diet becomes very limited.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's the one place we do get a little bit more concerned about, whether an exclusive plant-based diet is the most healthful approach when you're taking out these categories of foods that just provide so much, nutrition. Like we had a mom the other day who was saying, her son was celiac, so couldn't have any gluten. I think there was a soy allergy and maybe like a tree nut or a nut allergy. I can't remember. Like, yeah, that's a lot of things to navigate around, and that might be a lot harder to meet those needs. Again, especially when we're talking about these critical periods of just growth and development.
I agree with you. I really agree with you when it comes to that. Yeah. So I want to ask you if you have just some top, really hard hitting tips for parents who are considering going plant based or are just, starting into that whole journey of how they can really, be confident about feeding their families healthfully and meeting their nutrition needs.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the one that we say a lot is every little bit counts. Every bit of plant-based eating is beneficial, and that's really true when we look at the vast research that's out there for children and adults. Right, every sort of bit of shift on that plant-based continuum is going to see health benefits. So if you're starting at a place perhaps where you don't eat a lot of plant-based foods naturally in your family, but you're curious about this, like it doesn't have to be all or nothing, especially if you're trying to get buy-in from the family, and especially if that contains older children or perhaps even partners who are a little bit more resistant. What we like to say is think about meals that you already like that are already plant-based or almost that way, right? So think about things like tofu stir fry or spaghetti or various kinds of pastas. There's sort of all these foods that perhaps we don't think about that we actually enjoy. Bean and rice burritos that are naturally rooted in plant foods that are likely already accepted by the family, and that you can add more to those. And then the other thing I would say with that is, making it a family affair, right? So maybe you all decide to pick a recipe together or try new foods, letting your kids pick out a new vegetable. We do that a lot in my house because I'm really trying to combat this like picky selective eating phase. So we go to the grocery store and Vander gets to pick out, 3 foods he wants to try. He doesn't always try them, I will say that. But we come home together, he helps to like sort of put them in the fridge or on the counter. We talk about the characteristics of the food. So, there's a lot of ways to expose these foods, especially to young kids or really to any age where they're perhaps a little bit more unfamiliar.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I think it's also important for parents to educate themselves a little bit because there are some ins and outs about plant-based nutrition that they should know, namely supplementation. And supplementation should not be scary or confusing, but it is something that you should make yourself aware of so that you're following the proper guidelines when you switch to a plant-based diet. And we have a free supplement guide for pregnant women and children on our website for anyone who needs.
Yeah, I'm going to be giving everybody the link to all of these things that Alex and Whitney are talking about. So you'll have access to that. And I'm going to share how you can follow them on Instagram and social media. I really like those tips. Educating yourself is really important, and also looking for good types of resources because there's a lot of bad information.
Yeah, that's true.
On the internet. So how can
come to Sharon, come to us.
Read our book, read Sharon's book, and then
that's all you
need.
Yes, I mean, if you look for a registered dietitian, we do have the education,
yes,
nutrition,
that's what I would say.
And look for evidence-based information from respectable organizations because you just see so much. Yeah. Very non-evidence-based information. You don't want to rely on that.
Yeah,
I would say for meal inspiration, there's tons of vegan and plant-based moms out there that are sharing great recipes. That's a great place to go. But if you're talking about the nutrition facts, the evidence-based information, you should really be getting that from an expert source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And exactly. And you guys have beautiful recipes to look at.
Oh, well, I was also going to say, and make it fun. I mean, I really believe that feeding children should be so enjoyable, and making mealtime as fun as possible. And like, look, I know there's going to be, things to navigate with various kids and personalities and what you're, also dealing with yourself when it comes to food preferences. But as much as we can, making this a really enjoyable experience. It's not just about the food that we put on the plate, right? It's the experience of that family meal, of sitting together, of enjoying that food. And and not to let that be lost when you're considering all of the nutrition. We try to make nutrition as easy as possible, but also talk about the other factors sort of come with us when we come to sit down for a meal together.
I love that, because it's like you're starting your own family traditions, your own food culture.
Yeah.
And with this plant-based emphasis, it doesn't have to feel restrictive. It should just open it up more. I mean, now it's about celebrating diverse foods, plants, seasonal plants, fruits, vegetables, all these amazing, and all the tastes and the herbs and spices. So
yeah,
I think
think about what you're expanding on your palate, not what you're, restricting or taking away. There are so many foods out there that perhaps you don't always think about in that sort of standard westernized approach to like the meat and three. But there are, there's 2,000 fruits. Like there's a lot of plant foods out there that are new and exciting and just waiting for you to try them.
I always say that when I went I just always say when I went plant-based, I actually felt more liberated. I felt like my diet opened up more. I briefly mentioned eating 6 egg whites a day. I had a very narrow view of what was healthy and feeling like I had to eat chicken breast a couple times a day. And I definitely felt more restricted the way I was eating before than I do now.
That's true. I feel the same way, when I went completely plant-based, because then you're just really exploring, like all the beans and all the nuts and all the seeds, and of course all the fruits and vegetables, and I think taking kids to the farmer's market, growing some, if you have a little bit of land or a little pot, for the front step or the kitchen window to grow some veggies with your kids, and just get them on that journey to understanding where food comes from. I think that's so important as part of this whole lifestyle, and also, introducing the environmental benefits of eating this way, because kids, we know now that the younger generation is so passionate about our diet's impact on the planet. So I think that's a cool part of the whole story too.
Totally.
Yeah. We just got to get everyone else there.
And I also love what you say is you're very inclusive. Like, even if people just want to start getting more plant-based, it's fine. I've always had the same philosophy. We're just getting on that road and we're taking better care of ourselves and the planet. And
the reality is too, it's, we don't need everyone to go vegan, but we need a lot of us to eat more plants and a lot less animal products. That's really clear, whether you're talking about Eat Lancet or the Oxford study or, UN. There's all of these pushes to get us to eat more plants. So I don't think it does anyone any good to sort of come out with a, 100% or bust message. I think the more that we can say, like, here are the benefits, here are all the ways that we can sort of meet you where you're at, but we do need to do this, not just for planetary health, but also, hey, it's a huge win for your own personal health as well. So whatever motivates you, I think there's a lot of different messaging in there. And I think that for us, we try to be as inclusive as possible, because we want everyone to come to us and feel like they're not being shut out by any message, but to really feel like, oh, okay, they're helping us eat more plants, wherever that looks like in my diet.
That's a positive message, and I love it. And I think you're doing a great job with that. And I also am excited because Alex and Whitney are sharing one of their favorite recipes. It's their French toast fingers with quick berry syrup. So I'm going to be putting that up on the blog that will go along with this interview. And I'm imagining that's your one of your kids' favorite recipes, I'm thinking, because it looks amazing.
Yeah, it's a really nice weekend recipe, and it was really born out of the idea that I think it's so silly that we put syrup on like waffles and pancakes. Like, why is that? So my kids have never had syrup, but they have this like berry syrup, which essentially is just like really reduced frozen berries and a little bit of vanilla. And it's just sort of a nice way if they want to have something to dip or to eat. But, I think there's no need to pour on, even like if we're talking like a maple syrup on a breakfast food. That always felt like a little silly to me. So it's a healthier sort of like, but also really beautiful, colorful, berry rich way to enjoy waffles or French toast sticks.
I love that idea, and just making fruit syrups. And, people have been doing that since the beginning of time, preserving all the harvest of fruit and making these products, these thick jams and preserves. So that's a great way to make it healthier and pretty, and kids love to be interactive with their food. So it hits dip. All of those.
Yeah. Yes. My son loves to dip everything. If I can dip it, we're good. So
that's great. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. It was wonderful. I think we learned so much about how we can feed our kids healthy plant-based diets the easy way. And please go check out Whitney and Alex's book. And again, I'm going to be sharing all of their links to their resources on the blog at SharonPalmer.com. So thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Sharon. It was so
nice
great
seeing
chatting
you.
with you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.